Broadcasting live from the Phoenix Business Radio X studio in Tempe, Arizona. You are tuning in to Culture Crush with Kendra Maples. This podcast will dive into a variety of companies that are crushing it with a great company culture.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Culture Crush Business Podcast. As a growing company, we are the culture improvement resource that supports companies and leaders. Our mission is to improve company cultures so that people can want to go to work. Employees and leaders should love where they work, and we truly believe that this is possible. So one of the things that we do on this show is share the ways that we can improve company culture. We do this in a variety of ways by bringing on companies that are doing great with their company culture and that are crushing it, and we can lead by example from what they're doing. The other way that we do this is through showcasing resources. So providing those resources to companies on how they can improve their company culture. There's a lot of different resources out there. So today, that's what we're focusing on. So today we're focusing on two individuals that are just huge resource banks when it comes to improving company culture. So I'm going to introduce the two of you, and then I'll pick one of you to go first. But I want you guys to kind of introduce yourself and tell us a little bit. I mean, I know about you guys because I've had the opportunity to chat and read and hear about you, but I want you to be able to showcase with our listeners. So without further ado, I would love to introduce everyone to Stephanie Angelo. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much, Kendra, for the invitation to be here.
No problem. I'm so excited. You and I had connected, I think, initially through LinkedIn, and we'll get into how because of one of the things you're doing in particular. So thank you for being here. And then we also have Larry Olsen here today. Larry, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a real privilege to be on your show, and I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. I'm excited. You and I have had the chance to connect and talk a few times as well. So, Larry, I'm going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about you, what you're doing, your background, kind of how you got to where you are today, and then we'll jump in more on the conversation of improving culture.
Well, I've been in performance-driven neurology for over 35 years now, and have had the great opportunity of working with many, many large companies and small entrepreneurial startups as well on getting behind the scenes relative to how the brain works and how we process information and how to get change to occur in an organization because of the people wanting it as opposed to leadership directing it. And when you put the combination together, remarkable things happen within an organization because people really are excited about where they work, and they're excited about where they work because the people there really care about them as human beings. And it's been a lot of fun throughout the years, and which brings us to this moment in time where I'm having the chance to talk to you within your studio and share more information.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm very excited to have you here, and we'll dive in a little more on some of the things that you're doing. Stephanie, what about you? Tell us a little bit about you.
Well, you and I actually met on Instagram.
Oh,
You
we
had
did.
posted something, and I responded to it because we were using the word game, and we'll get to that later, but I had invented
Yes.
a company culture game, and then you and I started this conversation, and you said, how about coming on the show? So that's where that happened. It wasn't LinkedIn, although a lot of things do happen for me on LinkedIn,
Right?
and a lot of things are happening on Instagram as well, but that's how you and I got
Oh, how
started.
fun.
And my background comes from being a human resources manager and director of HR in a couple of different organizations, and started working in company culture a few years back when I found that that's what my customers were actually asking for. You know, there's a saying, give your customers what they want. And so when that came up a lot, and I see our producer here is like going, yep, exactly. You're right, Daryl. You know, you give them what they want. And so they were really needing company culture help.
Mhm.
And that's where I stepped in. And I say in the short term, I help companies outlive, outlast, and outperform outperform their competition by having great company cultures.
I love that. And how long have you been? You said you started in more of that HR role, and then now you're a speaker and you're all over the place doing
Mhm.
culture talks. How did you kind of make that transition? How long have you been doing all of this?
Well, I left the internal HR world about 20 years ago and I started consulting on my own. And initially, I spent 16 or so years doing domestic violence work in the workplace.
Oh,
And I
wow.
spoke all over the country. I spoke in Europe. I did a lot of domestic violence work. I wrote a true crime memoir. And I invented a domestic violence educational board game called Outrage. But there's also a thing with domestic violence that I began to internalize it. And I felt it in my bones, and I began to really struggle personally with how much I was beginning to absorb with that.
Hmm.
And so I had to take a break. I just knew I needed to step back for a little while. So I stepped back for a couple of years and I ran actually mastermind groups through high stakes mastermind groups, which is another business of mine. And then, like I said, clients began to really ask about company culture. Now, having been internal in human resources, I had a lot of experience with really, really great cultures because they're out there,
Mm-hmm.
but sometimes you have to dig for them. And I had experience with really, really horrific cultures, even some that I experienced myself, where some really devastating things happened as a result of bad cultures.
Mm.
In one case, this is probably my worst story. I actually lost a pregnancy sitting in the office of a CEO who was screaming at me about some of the other managers. And that was a regular thing that he did, bring me in the office and scream at me about everybody else. And eventually it just took its physical toll on me. And that was only one situation, but those kinds of things, the great company cultures I worked with and the really serious ones and bad ones, toxic ones that I worked
Mhm.
with, all collided for me and made me really want to help other organizations.
Mhm.
And we do it in a really fun way, though. We have,
Yeah.
we're really looking for happy, healthy company cultures. But one thing I do want people to realize is what you do matters.
Mm-hmm.
And it can have great effect on people and it can have devastating effect on people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm glad you share that though, because Daryl knows that's one of the reasons why I started this show and started this company and this business, because I have been part of companies that had a great culture, right? And I've been part of some that just were not. And you have these moments and you have these examples like your example, that's horrendous. And that's out there. And that truly fueled this passion of mine. Okay, well, it's not, back in the day where you go to the mine, you do your job, you come home, you suck it up because it puts money in the bank and food, on the table for your family. We're in a different time now. And we've absolutely seen that throughout the past 3 years of this pandemic as well, right? This shift in this understanding that we do need to up our game, right? With helping and supporting our people. And, CEOs like that, I'm hoping he's not in that role anymore because
He was eventually removed, but here's the interesting thing. I repeatedly talked to the VP of Human Resources that I reported to,
Mhm.
and I had a couple dual reporting relationships. One was him and one was this other person.
Okay.
I told her numerous times the things that were happening. I didn't tell the personal story because I felt like I couldn't. I was HR. HR is supposed to be Teflon. And people forget that HR is human too, right?
Mhm.
But I was continuously telling her this story and these stories. And one day I said, he made Alice cry in the executive team meeting. And that VP sat forward and said, "What?" And I said, "He made Alice cry." And all of a sudden she took notice. I don't know why it was that sentence because I had been telling her stories
Mhm.
probably every time she and I met. So they did have a full-blown investigation. They ended up removing him,
Hmm.
but putting him in a position where he didn't supervise people.
Hmm. Okay. And this actually kind of leads me into one of the questions that I want to talk about. And Larry, I think it came up with you and I before is, how does leadership of a company, how do they really even know if their culture is healthy or if their culture is not, right? In this case, I'm sure he thought things were just swell and had no idea why people didn't want to talk to him or whatnot. Larry, what do you think about that? Like, how do people even really? How do leaders know if their culture is good or bad or healthy or needs improvement?
Well, I asked a leader one time, how do you know that your company's healthy? And he goes, I walk around and everybody seems to be in a good mood. And I said, well, do you know you can't be in a room without you being there? And it's funny how many of us will play games to come across in a certain fashion. And many leaders do it, sometimes unconsciously. They're not even aware of it. They're not aware of the fact that someone was yelling at them, as Stephanie just shared with us, that how can that possibly be taking place in my organization? And generally, what takes place is not so much that you've got mean-spirited leadership, it's just that they don't know any better. Now, you can say, no, we've had a lot of training and we've had a lot of programs we've brought in that they should be able to perform differently. But unless you get into how we think and how thinking affects performance, you get people that just nod and smile, and then they have a meeting after the meeting. So to really get down into the bones of what it is that makes us behave the way we do, we've got to ask ourselves, what do I want from this? What's in it for me? And if a leader is really looking just simply to improve the bottom line, then the best way to do that is to make sure your people really love what they're doing and want to be where they are within your organization. And the thing that draws that out is, what's your sense of purpose? Why are you doing what you're doing? And the works that we do are helping an organization articulate itself. Because once it decides that we're this type of an organization, even though they aren't, then all of a sudden, every other behavior that's not in alignment with that stands out like a sore thumb. And instead of punishing it, which 90% of corporations do, is they go ahead and they say, wow, that's a message to all of us on how do we become the organization where that kind of behavior can exist. And it's really a wonderful thing when you've got people now pointing out to one another that that's not who we are. We don't talk behind each other's backs. What we do is we bring out the best in others. And as you articulate that culture throughout the entire organization, and with my education, you start first with making sure everybody is educated, because 99% of people think about what's ever on their mind and less than 1% know how they think. And so they don't really recognize that these thoughts are accumulating to build beliefs. And then I'm acting accordingly. And until someone comes up to me, and most people, aren't looking for another job, so they don't walk up and say, you're not a very effective leader. Generally, they'll have that conversation elsewhere, and that does nothing to improve the quality of the organization, because those are the people that ended up in HR, and HR has to deal with them in whatever fashions and policies that organization has established. You want people that are doing the right thing, because not only do they know it's right, it's just inside their bones. It's innate. Most of us just want to do the right thing. But when we don't know what that is, or we're told, and you can't tell anyone into high performance, then you get the results of that, which are very limiting, even though they may think they're doing outstandingly. They're just scratching the surface as to what's possible for their organization when they make their people number one, instead of leadership trying to get the people to help them become number one.
So then how do you start this? Is it just the you said articulating your company culture? That was one of the things that you had talked about too, is the importance of having those conversations about company culture. So where does all of this start, right? And I asked this to the two of you, right? Knowing that you two, that's what you do, is provide resources to companies to help them improve their company culture, right? We have a lot of companies that come into the studio that we highlight them as a company that's doing well with company culture, but they've had to figure out those pieces along the way. So our conversation today is unique because I'm asking the two of you these questions from that perspective of helping companies, right? Helping them improve. So Larry, you're talking about needing to articulate the company culture and, not just, talking smack in the other room, because that's not going to do any good. So where do we start in all of this? Like, how do you even start to tackle these pieces?
I'm going to jump on that for just a second here. I think that you need to start by making it psychologically safe for people to talk, because they really won't. This is an employee's age. We're all talking about the Great Resignation. And I think one way to know whether or not you have a really good company culture is to watch your numbers. People might smile while you walk in the room, but I think there's one thing that I see a little bit differently than Larry, or see in addition to what Larry said, and that is that your numbers, if you're paying attention to them, are going to tell you a lot. If your turnover rates are high and your production rates are low, for example, that's going to tell you something if you're paying attention to your numbers. If you've got a revolving door, that's a problem. And if you're a manager who at least cares about that, that's significant, because there are those out there, like the CEO I told you about that yelled at everybody. He had a terrible culture, but he didn't really care. You have to care. So to get that conversation going, and turnover numbers are just one factor. Production numbers are just one factor. There are a lot of other formulas that we can look at. And if anybody needs those resources, like how to actually get those formulas, those calculations, I'm happy to share them, because they're not mine. I didn't write them, so I'm happy to share them if anybody wants to reach out to me. But I think that you do need to ask people, you need to talk to them, and you need to do it in a way that makes it psychologically safe. Because people are ghosting companies. Like, they come in for an interview and then they never show up again, or they accept the job, train a week or two, and disappear. Or maybe they're even there for a few months and then disappear. Why aren't they telling you what's going on? Because they're not feeling comfortable. They don't feel psychologically safe to talk. So to have a really good company culture, the thing that it starts with, to me, is the psychological safety in having a conversation, giving people an opportunity to talk. And it's not just asking them by handing out a sheet of paper with an employee opinion survey, fill out these bubbles, and then we're going to run it through a machine that just tells you the percentages. That's not enough. It is a tool. And I'm not saying anything against employee opinion surveys, because they definitely serve a great purpose. But actually talking to people. And that's one of the benefits of the company culture game. It was designed for that very purpose, not only to get people to have fun while they play the game and to talk about the things that they see on the cards, but to also see what it's like to be in other people's shoes. And then it's a very purpose-driven game where the outcome of it is to talk about the things that you've discovered in your conversations of the game, and then to create initiatives for the organization moving forward. Now that we've had this workshop and this game, here's what we're going to do as a great result of it.
I am looking at Daryl when I say this. So the last show that we did, he's smiling, he knows. The last show that we did, we had a company, we had Arizona Wilderness Brewing Company. Amazing, amazing team, and very diverse cultures. They've got the culture of a brewing company, they've got the culture of a restaurant, and then they've got their own company culture that they're growing, right? And one of the things that they started doing were culture conversations. And it's a meeting. It's all, up to the staff if they want to join this meeting, but there's no leadership in the room. There's no CEOs or anything like that. There's a couple of folks that are kind of taking the ownership of this and taking that leadership role so that it doesn't kind of turn into, quite frankly, a bitch fest, right? Larry, like you were saying, there has to be something productive with these conversations. And so they're starting these culture conversation groups so that they can say, hey, this happened the other day. Or, maybe that's an opportunity, like your example. You can say, hey, this happened the other day. This person yelled and this person did this. And then you can dive into it from the perspective of growing your culture and not just talking smack to an employee about something else that happened.
I think that's interesting. And I've been to that restaurant a couple of times. I think it's interesting that they do that and they bring people in the conversation and they deliberately have the people outside the room that might make it uncomfortable. Having said that, this game was designed to have them in the room so that you can see what it's like to be in each other's shoes. And the whole roll of the dice decides what role you play. So an hourly person could be the CEO or something.
Okay.
And I will tell you, there was one situation where something came up on a card and the CEO was like, well, that doesn't happen in my company. And the person sitting next to them said, well, actually, it does. And that started this whole conversation. And so you need those little sparks that will get things going.
Yeah. And needing both, needing the opportunity to have that conversation without your CEO there, and then having the conversation with having both. I've seen that in a variety of the roles that I've held in leadership. a lot of times folks are very open and willing to talk to me about things. And then I have to be that voice to the CEO because they're not that person, right? They're not ready. They're not, open. They just don't feel like they can talk to the CEO of the company. So I think it's a good balance of both having opportunities like your game to be able to showcase and have both sides, every side in the room. But then like what Arizona Wilderness Brewing is doing, allowing them to have these conversations in a room without leadership. But then, like I said, there is that individual who's kind of taking the lead, and then they will take notes on what needs to leave the room and actually go to leadership and be like, hey, this is what's happening with, your staff and with the culture, so that they are looped into it. So it's definitely, I think, both sides of that.
For sure. It's that psychological safety in talking.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's a little cart before the horse kind of reality here. If we're going to create psychological safety for any leaders that are listening to this right now and are thinking about bringing a board game in or thinking about asking their people what's going on that isn't necessarily bringing out the best in other people, is the question's got to be asked first of the leader, why do you want this? Because if you don't get into the heart and mind of the person running the company, if they're just, you've really got to be able to peel the onion to find out why do they want to make their company better. And those are the reasons where you're going to find out whether it's going to work or not, because you can bring anything you want into a company. You can bring myself and Stephanie and anybody in, but change isn't going to occur because it's like the old joke about how many psychiatrists it takes to change a light bulb. And the answer is it only takes one, but the light bulb has really got to want to change. And that is where psychological safety comes from. It's by the leader recognizing that they've got to be the model of change itself. And if you look into the fears of man, number one is rejection. That's why we're so concerned about what other people think. Number two is change. So you're coming in, confronting them with a reality that is just numbing. And you can't get lip service on, no, we want to do this. Yeah, that would really be great. You've got to find out why. And in that process, you find out, is this a client or not? Is this someone that's really going to be able to have an organization that actually knows what it's like to live from a purpose? To be able to really understand what it means to be vulnerable, to be transparent, to be able to, like she was sharing, say, did you know your people feel that way? You've got a lot of background that has to occur first, and it doesn't have to be difficult to just really find out, are you willing to model it? I can't tell you how many clients I took on in my younger years just for the economics of it. And it was a nightmare because they weren't ready to change. And you find that out when you recognize that, something's stopping all of this wonderful stuff that we're attempting to do. So those of you that are thinking about bringing in this, and she's got an amazing process, board game. It's absolutely phenomenal. But you've really got to get that mind in the right place first. Because if they don't learn how to change their minds, then they'll change the opportunity every single time.
Yeah. And I really appreciate that, Larry. That's a very generous plug, and I appreciate that. And one thing that Larry and I spoke about, because we met on the phone and we had a conversation, one thing that we really agreed on, we totally get, because we're both in that space, is that wanting to have that change happen. Because I've seen companies that have had, for example, sexual harassment training because somebody raised a complaint. And now they just need to check the box. Yep, we complied. We did the training, but they don't care about making any kind of change in the organization. So with that kind of training or any other backlifting training, anything that you do, you have to do it for a reason that goes beyond just checking the box. And Larry and I are in total agreement with this. This is something that prevents that revolving door. You've got to care, because this is an employee's market. They no longer have that loyalty. Like you said in the intro, Kendra, about companies, people that used to stay with companies 30, 40 years, their entire career. That just is not happening
Mm-mm.
anymore. I mean, you're really lucky if you get maybe 5 years out of somebody because they don't feel the loyalty. And if they're not growing with the company, if they've got nowhere to go and they're certainly not happy there, they will leave. I mean, employees won't go across the street for 10 cents more an hour. They won't. I mean, if you've got to have a significant benefits package, like 20% more, to go across the street for something better. Having said that, they will leave bad management in a heartbeat.
Mm-hmm.
And 80% of employees will leave a company if they find that it's not ethical and honest with them.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, Larry and I had a really nice conversation about that yesterday because
Nice.
you're like, yes, I understand that. Yes, I get that. We feel the same.
Oh, I'm so glad. So then what happens? I've seen so many situations where maybe leadership thinks that things are fine, right? They think it's, oh, culture's fine. Or like you said, they maybe just don't care. But then you have maybe that middle management that really wants to try and improve, right? But you have to have that buy-in. We've talked about it a lot in this show. You have to have that buy-in from the top. So what does that look like from the perspective for you two? Like, have you ever gone in to support a company and then you realize the CEO really doesn't care? Do you say no? Do you back out? Do you say, hey, we need to move forward at a different point in time? What does that kind of look like?
I think some of the most important elements are asking the CEO, what is it that you do want?
Mm-hmm.
What is it that you're striving to accomplish? And even if it's just to improve the bottom line through their people instead of improving their people, which will improve the bottom line, if you can get them to recognize that you can get them what they want by them simply doing something that most of us do a terrible job at, and that's learning how to listen. And, she mentioned about caring, I think it was Theodore Roosevelt who said, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And most people don't spend enough on the caring part. They just want to get their message across. And without that listening, you as a vendor or someone from the outside coming in, you won't find out why they're in business and why they're doing what they're doing. And you might be offended by what they really want. And I'm okay with that because I know that they're going to change their mind. Because I have yet to meet anyone that is a total you-know-what and doesn't want improvement. But because of their upbringing and some of the challenges they've faced, as we've heard about, just from the harassment element, some of these people come from such dysfunctional families and they really don't know a better way. And so when you're offering them the opportunity to not only improve the bottom line, but improve themselves as a human being, and you've spent enough time listening, they will become transparent enough. If after that they don't, then they're not a good fit anyway. They're in no danger really of allowing wonderful things to happen in their company. And if they've got a board, they're large enough, the board's going to get rid of them anyway. But we'd rather give people the opportunity to improve rather than just sweep them out, because they've got a lot of experience and knowledge to bring to the party. And I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people make is they try to get rid of people too quickly, thinking that now we're going to be able to rock and roll. When in reality, boy, if you don't help someone, no matter what level, change and give them the tools necessary to be able to do that, then what on earth do you plan on doing with the company?
But having said that too, one thing that we sort of touched on yesterday is sometimes there are companies that, at least in my case, I've walked away from because I feel like you have to be an organization that really, really cares and really wants change because you have something struggling, something's not working. You've had a merger, an acquisition, you've laid people off. Something has happened that's been a trigger to your culture. Or you're an organization that has a really great culture and you want to continuously do things to keep it great. Because if you stop doing that, you're going to stagnate. And if you stagnate long enough, you're going to go backwards. The companies I will not work with are the ones that have really crappy cultures and they also don't care. And they don't want to change it.
Right.
Larry and I had such an agreement on this yesterday.
Yeah.
And I had a conversation. In fact, I did a LinkedIn video on this a couple of weeks ago, speaking of LinkedIn, where somebody had asked me once if there's an organization that I'd walk away with. And I told them this story. Now, I am not editorializing on faith, religion, or anything, but I'm just telling a story. I had a woman who contacted me from a church organization that had like 100 people that needed some sort of continuing education. And they wanted culture training. And so she asked me about the workshop, which includes this exclusive game. And in the conversation, I told her a lot about how much diversity is in the cards. It's got a lot of questions and scenarios that regard diversity, either things that make you go forward or things that make you go backwards. Because in this game, it's kind of like the game of Sorry. Certain things make you go around the board forwards and certain things make you go backwards. Okay, so we were talking about how this game has a lot of things in it which encompass diversity, not only, racial equality, but LGBTQ. I can't even say the alphabet anymore today. But then I never heard from her again. And I don't know the reason why, but there's something in my gut that tells me that just didn't fit what they wanted to deal with. And so the person I told the story to said, well, why wouldn't you just take those cards out of the game? And I said, no, because that's not true to myself. And the reason I created this and what I stand for in my own practice. So if this is an organization, whether it's this faith-based one or anything where it's like, no, we're not supporting diversity, then you're not a client for me, because that's a part of who I am.
And not only is it a part of who you are, but that's a part of what company culture is.
Exactly.
You can't get away from that. You can't you can't erase that. Diversity and inclusion and equality and needing that diversity, that's how you're going to grow your company culture. If everybody looks the same, thinks the same, is from the same, place that they all grew up, there's no diversity in the way they look, but there's no diversity in the way that they think. And you're not going to have the growth of the culture the way that you should. So I'm so glad to hear that that was the stance that you took, because those two things go hand in hand. And I will say the diversity and inclusion conversation comes up in probably every show that we have, because it's just part of that conversation of culture. People, passion, diversity, it's just part of that same conversation. So I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you.
Stuck with it. And I'm sure, Larry, you can probably say the same thing, that it's part of that conversation that you're probably having with companies as well. It's part of culture growth.
Yeah, it's when I mentioned about the CEO who maybe had the wrong reasons for wanting to improve the culture, I wouldn't continue to work with them if those reasons didn't change. If in their heart they didn't recognize that what they were saying was not bringing out the best in others. And I continue to say that. I had a sister who was 3 years older than I was, and my parents watched me when I would just barely stand up, pushing her in the stroller. 3 years older. She's 3 years older than I am. So they went in and they had him tested. And things were pretty archaic then. And they pretty much stamped mentally retarded on her forehead. And we call it differently abled, gifted. There's many different terms for people that don't have the same, perhaps, opportunities that we have, for some kind of difference that they may display. And I grew up a little differently, recognizing that, why am I getting in so many fights for my sister because of all of these kids teasing her? And I realized it wasn't the children's fault, because people, when you get uncomfortable with differences, sometimes we make comments or we act certain ways. And I, at the time, I just didn't understand it. And when you grow up, you recognize it's still going on, and people maybe don't even have the right understanding that they should, because they didn't grow up with it. And we all recognize that sometimes there's mean-spirited people out there. But when people recognize what was going on, they were apologetic. They felt bad. They wished they hadn't have said it. And the same thing happens in a very healthy culture that maybe started out a little dysfunctional, because there's a lot of sarcasm and there's a lot of teasing and belittling. And, in sarcasm, usually somebody is hurt by it. Years ago, I was doing a seminar and there's probably about 500 people in the room. And I was about maybe 5 minutes into it. And one of the guys in the back of the room raised his hand. He said, "Hey, could you do me a favor?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he goes, "Could you get me some sunglasses so I can block out that glare off your forehead?" And the whole room is laughing. And on the inside, I'm laughing. And, I'm laughing on the outside. On the inside, I've got some words that I'm not going to use online now that I was saying to this individual. Because we don't know, just because everybody's laughing, we don't know what the impact is on the person that the comment is made about. Mm-hmm. So bottom line, don't make the comment to begin with. Mm-hmm. First, find out what someone's story is. And that's what the whole process of culture and developing a great culture is all about. Mm-hmm. Is, when a leader's ready to fire somebody or to punish somebody for being late to a meeting, and they don't know it well enough to find out, to keep their mouth shut, wait till the meeting's over and find out why the person was late. They just found out their wife has terminal cancer, or that the lunch wasn't quite ready yet for the child before they went on. They're so glad they didn't say anything. Mm-hmm. And that's what a real healthy culture is all about. When people feel comfortable bringing out the best in each other, because they realize unless they do, the alternative is unacceptable. And this great resignation can't become the great re-inspiration if we're going back for $20 an hour more to an organization that still doesn't have the transparency to really care what your story is. Mm-hmm. And so I learned a long time ago, find out the story before you offer any kind of tutelage or instruction or hopefully not punitive measures.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you say that, because at the root of all of it, we're humans, right?
Yep.
And I'm teaching this to my stepdaughter right now, because sometimes you just wake up in a bad mood. I get it. Yep. That's fine. But we kind of have to work together on that. Just because one person woke up in a bad mood, it kind of works both ways, right? She doesn't have the right to go to school and be a jerk to somebody else that they didn't deserve it, but then vice versa, right? If she's interacting with somebody and, like you're saying, they're in a bad mood, something happened, they were late, whatever, she can't go into that scenario just thinking, oh, this person's a jerk, because she doesn't know what they're going through. She doesn't know what they've been through. And it's crazy, because I'm teaching an 11-year-old this, right? But I feel like I've taught my adult teammates and my adult, interns and individuals that I've led on teams before, this same thing, right? We're people. Understand people at the root of just being human.
You bet.
Yeah. I had a stepmother, and she used to say, it's okay to wake up on the wrong side of the bed. Just let people know that you did.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, figure out what you need to do in the morning to make that a little bit better.
Yeah. It happens.
And a good tool for that, for all of us, an internal trigger is when we're about to get defensive. And we all know that feeling, whether it comes out verbally or not. We're sending over 250,000 messages with our body language and tone of voice before we open our mouth up. Mm-hmm. Was what Emerson said, "Who you are speaks so loud, I can't hear what you're saying." So we don't even have to let it out of our mouth, just a raised eyebrow or whatever. So when we see this trigger of defensiveness coming on, ask yourself, what am I trying to defend? And you know what the answer is? You're right to stay the same, because you're not looking for new information. You're not finding out. And one of the things that, I've got 5 children, one of the things we have to be careful of in raising children is don't feel that way, making statements like that. And why'd you do that? And, here's what you should do. Instead of, how are you feeling? Tell me a little more about that. Mm-hmm. And the other element, as you all know, is even with an 11-year-old, what would you like to have happen? Well, Mary is so mean. What would you like to see happen with Mary? Mm-hmm. And we've got to help people make that shift. Well, I'd like Mary to be nice to me. Well, how are you treating Mary? Mm-hmm. Well, I'm really nice to Mary. Well, you just told me you didn't like Mary. Well, I'm trying to be. In any time you hear try leads to doubt leads to hesitation, and hesitation leads to failure. So these little words that we're using is what we need to be paying attention to in our people, and ask questions about them, so we can really find out what needs to be changed here. And one of the things that I always tell leaders in my leadership program is the first step in great leadership is to get over yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean you're not miraculous. It doesn't mean you're not amazing. It doesn't mean you don't have 100 billion neurons. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means that it's not about you anymore.
Right.
You are now someone that's bringing out the best in others. And that's the type of education that people need to have, so that they don't get defensive, fold their arms, and wait till the program goes away, so they can start behaving as they were before it came in. That does not change a culture.
Yeah. 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 He's kind of referring to something called high distance hierarchy, right, Larry? It's that authoritarian.
I didn't know it
type
had
of
a name.
Yeah, it's that authoritarian type of culture and leadership that maybe was okay 50 years ago, but it's passé now, and it's thankfully beginning to dwindle away. But some people are like clutching onto it, like like rabid dogs or something, and they think that being authoritarian is going to get them what they want. But it really, really is the makings for a very toxic culture where people maybe are afraid of you and doing what they're told, but they certainly aren't happy and they're not going to stay. And when you have that low distance hierarchy and you're basically in the same line as the people that you work with, people want to please you. And one of the places that I worked was at Scottsdale Air Park, and we had a general manager. I worked for a fixed-based operation up there. We had a general manager that was just, I tell stories about him. He had these bright blue eyes and this short kind of cropped blondish hair and a short beard. And he was about 5'9". And honest to God, I think he looked like what Santa would have looked like when he was 38 years old. And he just had this demeanor about him that was so open and warm and fun and humorous that you never felt like, this is the big guy, this is the big wig, and he just really empowered people to make decisions so long as they were doing it for the good of the company and they were doing their very best. And so people really just wanted to do their best for him, to make him happy. And it made the whole culture so joyous to work for. It was just so fun. You talk about that family kind of thing, and families do have a lot of odd dynamics, right? But this one was just a really nice functioning family because of what he did as a leader. He wasn't authoritarian. He was just like one of us. He just had a different job. Made it wonderful.
I love that. And I think I mentioned this book in probably every show we have, but you were talking about, get over yourself, get over your attitude. The book by Jocko Willink, Extreme Ownership. And it's Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. They were Navy SEALs. So the whole book is about taking pieces of what they learned as Navy SEALs, and then they implement it into the business world. But one of the things that the way they refer to it is check your ego. The way that they were able to lead a team and have, you have some hierarchy, right? You have that order of who reports to who. But as a leader, that's how you, like you were saying, that's how you get your people to have that, appreciation for you. And they want to be part of your team and they want to, please you and whatnot because you don't have that ego. So they call it check your ego, being open to those conversations. And like you said, Larry, just get over yourself, right?
What sounds really great about that book? I haven't read it, so I'll have to get my hands on that. But what sounds really great about that check your ego is that Navy SEALs in and of themselves are the best of the best. I mean, these are elite
right?
people. So if they can say check your ego when they've got a lot to be egotistical about,
absolutely,
I think I want to get that book.
It's fantastic. And like I said, it's all about leadership. They have a variety of other points that they bring up too, but I think Daryl has probably heard me mention this book in every show because they take those pieces and then they apply it to the business world. And it just, like the check your ego, it makes sense when you translate it into conversations like these, right? And then Larry, the other thing that you said that I was picking up on as well, you were talking about the communication without words though. And I want to go back to that because I think that when we're talking about company culture, when we're talking about leadership, that is vital. I think there's a lot of things that are assumed in the workplace. But when it comes to communication, majority of the communication you have with people is your actions, your behaviors. It's not in anything that you say at all. And I thought it was really ironic that you mentioned that today because yesterday was International Polar Bear Day, just so you guys know, if you didn't know that. I know that because Daryl's laughing at me. I know that because that is a huge part of my background. And what I used to do was working with animals and studying. So I made a post on LinkedIn yesterday about the similarities with working with people and working with animals. And one of the biggest things is the communication that is nonverbal. And so that's a huge piece of it. And then consistency, right? The repetition of positive reinforcement and working with your teams. It's the same thing with people. It's the same thing when you're working with animals. So I love that you mentioned that about the communication that's not anything that you actually said, right? And I feel like, again, that's one of the things I've worked with my teams on and my 11-year-old is I know you said that, but you said that with a different face.
Right.
Your face said something different.
Your eyes were rolling when you said, "Sure, Mom, happy to."
Yeah. So it's like you said, Stephanie, it's that family thing. There's a little bit of this overlap with the way you work with your family and the way you work with your teams. It's all very similar.
Yeah.
So we are getting a little bit closer to the end. So I'm looking, I have so many things and so many thoughts. I love when I have individuals like the two of you in the room because you are just resource banks, right? For helping companies and helping companies improve. And especially those companies that we talked about where they know they need to, right? The first step, they know they need to. Yeah. They're acknowledging they need to. And then what, right? And that's one of the reasons why I started the show and I started this company was because there's a lot of resources out there and it depends on maybe what it is that they need the right resource for their company. And a lot of this people are just Googling things online, right? Trying to find the right resources. So I want to take advantage of the fact that I have the two of you in the room because you are these amazing resource banks. So I want to give each of you just a few minutes, whatever is your tips, your takeaway, whatever advice, whatever it is that you would like to share with our listeners. And I'll give you a little bit of insight into some of our listeners. We kind of have two different categories of folks and ages, and it tends to be the younger individuals that are wanting to work for a good company, a good company culture, right? They are listening to the show, and I'm putting a little bit of an assumption as we look at numbers and we look at ages and things like that. But they're listening to the show because, Stephanie, like you said, they don't have to sit in a job for 30 years like they used to, right? So they're listening for who are these other companies that I could work for. But then the other huge chunk of listeners that we have are company leaders that are listening for how they can improve. So with that being said, go back to my question. I want to give each of you a moment, just whatever tips, whatever tricks. Stephanie, if it's mentioning more about the game, Larry, if it's telling us a little bit more about your company, I want to give you both a few moments. So, Larry, I'm going to start with you. What are your takeaways, your tips, anything that you want to be able to share with our listeners?
Well, thank you. I thank you for the time, and it's been enjoyable listening to the conversation and participating in it. So I'm very grateful for that. And for those of you listening out there, one of the important elements that I would share is my book, Get a Vision and Live It. And it's all about how to change your mind. And I bring that up because I'd also like to mention that I do an onboarding program. And in that program, I share a story with people because you've got all these new eager faces. They finally left that culture that they were so overwhelmed with. And here's a new chance, a new beginning. And there's a lot of emotion going on and a lot of mindset relative to what's going to be happening. And I share this story with them. I tell them a story about a buddy and I who had a bet to see who had the most jobs. And this was way back in 1983. And he had had 22 jobs. And I had beat him by one. I had 23. And I go into it, not enough time now to share what some of those jobs were because they weren't packaging groceries. They were, owned a construction company, taught school for 7 years. I mean, they went on and on and on. But what I share with these people is that every time I went to the new job, I asked myself, what was wrong with the old one? And it was generally I wasn't getting respected or paid enough. So then I went to the next job. And after a while, I wasn't getting respected or paid enough. And, I'm not the sharpest kid in the neighborhood. So it took me a while to figure out there's a common denominator here. And that common denominator was me. I kept changing my jobs, thinking it would change my life, instead of recognizing what I really needed to do is change my mind. Because guess who I kept bringing to the next job? And our brain is so designed not to get us what we want, but to get us what we're thinking about. And unless what you want and what you're thinking about are the same thing, you keep getting what you're thinking about. So I kept finding reasons to leave that organization. So I would ask any of you that are attempting to make a change, what's going to be different this time? And if you're not bringing someone new to the party, then it's not going to take long before you become a statistic of only being able to stay at a job so long. And boy, our country is great at coming up with statistics. We got them from millennials and Zs, and we get those into leaders' heads, and now they're looking for them. Instead of recognizing that people are not going to leave you when you care about those people and are utilizing their ideas and their creativity and getting over having to be right, because most people would rather be right than successful. And remember, I was right every time I left. I went, see, I was right. I wasn't getting respected or paid enough. And it goes in every area of our lives. So you want a little more info, you can go to LarryOlsenLive.com. Olsen is Olsen. And I just thank you for caring enough about yourself to even be listening to this podcast. And all the best. And hopefully that tip can get you some insights.
I love that. Larry, thank you. And if people are listening, is that the best way that they can reach out and get in touch with you? Or is there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. LarryOlsenLive.com.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stephanie, what about you? What are your last takeaways today?
Well, Larry makes a good point about always bringing himself to the next place and wanting to do better and be better. And I think that's prevalent with most employees. So what we need to do as employers is make sure that we don't snuff them out right at the beginning when they're trying to bring their best self. So how do we get around that? So in order to not let people think that I'm one-dimensional, the company culture workshop and game is not all I do. I'm not one-dimensional. I also do strategic thinking. I do workshops on cultures of learning and how to create that in your organization, because employees are begging to learn. In fact, the Society for Human Resource Management found that, and yes, statistics, but they found that rates 100% with individuals that they want opportunities to learn. So I have a workshop on how to develop a culture of learning in your organization. I have one on how to develop core team accountability in your organization. So there are many different things that I do. And I love working with organizations to help them reach all of these different facets, kind of like spokes of a tire. It's not just one thing in the center. It's all these different parts of the spoke that make the company. And so, I'm not a one-trick pony, so I have a lot to offer and a lot of fun. And everything includes hands-on, working together, not being lectured to. So we have a lot of fun. And I can be reached at Stephanie@stephanieangelo.com. That's my website, that's my email. My website is stephanieangelo.com. And I'm local to you, Kendra. So I'm right here in
Yes.
Phoenix. And so I'm at 480-646-2400. I had to think what my number was.
That's okay.
And I know,
You
what's
don't
my
call
phone number? I
yourself
don't call
often.
myself. 480-646-2400. And people can also go on my website, and there's like a little icon type thing that lets you schedule yourself for
Oh,
a
nice.
30-minute. You can just have a consultation with me for 30 minutes at no cost. It'll put you right in my calendar. So I invite people to do that and just ask questions about what can we do at our company? How do we improve our culture? What can we do to get started? And it all starts with a conversation.
Mhm.
It all begins with talking, like you and I did on Instagram,
Right.
which was so fun.
And I love that it
Right.
was Instagram. I totally forgot about that.
Yeah.
The world of connections and the avenues that we can do that.
Yeah, and so that it's just great to come down here and be with you here in the studio. I'm lucky to be able to be in the studio. Larry's there in California, but we see him on camera, so I get to look at his face and hi, Larry, you know. And of course Daryl here in the room, the producer. So thank you so much. That's been a hoot. It's been a great time talking with you.
Thank you. And again, I'm so glad I had, both of you on today. Like I said earlier, we tend to match a company that has a great culture with a resource, but I love mixing it up and having the opportunity to showcase two different resources that are out there to help companies with improving their company culture. And Stephanie, like you said, it's not just one piece, right? It's not just one spoke of the wheel, right? There's so many different directions and areas that companies need help and need support. So Larry and Stephanie, thank you to both of you. I really appreciate you guys. For everyone else, Culture Crush has vetted resources and partnerships with the right people and the right resources to help improve your company culture. Like I said before, we truly believe that everybody should love and want to go to work in the morning. So on this podcast, remember, we focus on everything surrounding businesses with a good company culture. We deep dive into companies that are crushing it with a great company culture. And as always, like today, we showcase companies that are resources to help companies improve. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Culture Crush, the only podcast out there that does a deep dive of companies that are crushing it with a great company culture. If you think your company has a strong culture that should be highlighted, please reach out to Kendra Maples on LinkedIn or email us at culturecrushpodcast@gmail.com.